At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's General G. Let's begin. When EBIP stepped out of his personal spacecraft and set foot on the barren soil of planet Venar, his entire body went rigid, struck by the emptiness of the ancient land. The feeling of desolation, however, was short-lived. Moments later, his eyes were already darting around, searching for one of the many ancient sapient statues left behind by the people who once inhabited the planet. They were an ancient race, a species EBIP hoped could answer a question that had troubled his scholarly mind for years. Why was humanity banned from galactic combat? The question was far from simple, despite how easily it could be asked. Driven by a burning need to know, and by the implications the truth might conceal, EBIP clutched his flowing scholar's robes, pulling the fabric close against his red-scaled body, as he began his journey across the plains of green crystals that seemed to blanket the forsaken planet. The crystalline formations jutted from the ground at odd angles, some no taller than his knee, others towering above him like spears thrust up from the planet's core, reflecting the light of the weak sun overhead. The star itself was unremarkable, a dying ember in the cosmic darkness that provided hardly enough warmth to keep the planet from freezing solid. EBIP's instruments confirmed that the atmosphere composition was similarly unremarkable. Nitrogen, oxygen, trace gases, nothing that would pose a threat to his respiratory system. But there was one constant on this world that set his nerves on edge: the wind. It never stopped, never even paused. It howled across the crystalline plains with a mournful sound that seemed almost alive, as if the planet itself were mourning what it had lost. Minutes passed as he continued his journey to find one of the statues. When he finally spotted the towering figure of a statue perhaps half a kilometer away, relief flooded through him with such intensity that his knees nearly buckled. He rushed toward it as fast as his exhausted body would allow, his robes tangling around his red-scaled legs and threatening to trip him with every step. When he reached the statue, EBIP immediately positioned himself in the pleasant shade it cast, collapsing against its base with a gasp of relief and blaming his unremarkable physical prowess for how much the short trip had tired him. As he recovered enough to think clearly, EBIP took his first proper look at the statue. The sight of it sent a chill down his spine. It was weird. The shape itself was unremarkable enough. A huge bipedal creature, perhaps 4 times his own height, caught in a pose that suggested it had been walking when whatever happened to it occurred. Its proportions were different from his own, with longer legs and shorter arms, but not so alien as to be incomprehensible. No, what disturbed EBIP, what made his scales want to stand on end, was the material the statue was made from. Tiny, colorful crystals of white, yellow, and blue covered every centimeter of the figure, growing in a way that seemed designed to restrain movement. But more disturbing than the visual effect was the sensation the statue gave off. It had a vague aura, something EBIP couldn't quite define, but felt with absolute certainty. The impression of a being who had been trapped against its will in a distant past. The statue seemed to radiate suffering, silent and eternal, a scream frozen in crystalline form that no one could hear, but everyone could feel. EBIP swallowed hard, his throat clicking with the motion, and reached up to touch his right temple. His claws tapped against the small metal disc embedded there, his specially modified translation implant, the pride of his collection and the result of trading favors with the best xenolinguists in the galaxy. "Ancient Elder," EBIP said, his voice hoarse from the short trip. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing his tone into something more respectful. "Ancient Elder, can you hear me? I have traveled very far to seek your wisdom. I come in peace as a scholar, seeking only knowledge." Nothing happened for a moment. Then there was noise. It started as the faintest sensation, more felt than heard. A vibration that seemed to originate from deep within the statue itself, resonating through the crystalline structure. It was unlike anything EBIP had ever experienced. Not quite a sound, not quite a physical sensation, but something that existed in the strange space between the two. The vibration grew stronger, more intense, and suddenly dust began to fall from the statue in small cascades. Particles of crystalline debris, accumulated over who knows how many centuries, shook loose and drifted down like strange, glittering snow. Some of it fell on Ebip's head and shoulders, and he brushed it away absently, his attention fixed entirely on the statue above him. His translation implant struggled for a moment, its processing algorithms working frantically to parse this alien form of communication. Then suddenly, a breakthrough. The vibration resolved itself into something his mind could comprehend. A voice, deep and resonant, projected directly into his consciousness in a way that bypassed his ears entirely. "What brings a star traveler to this forgotten world?" the voice asked. "What purpose drives you to disturb the sleep of the fallen? What do you seek among the ruins of the dead?" He took a moment to collect his thoughts, to choose his words with the care they were deserved. When he spoke, he made sure to maintain the respectful tone he had begun with, knowing that his first impression might determine whether this ancient being would help him or simply fall silent again. "Honored Elder," Ebip began, "I am Ebip, a scholar from the planet Zoripthas. My species, the Zorip, are new to the galactic stage. We joined the Galactic Council only 37 standard years ago. When we joined, we were given a comprehensive summary of the last 10,000 cycles of galactic history, as is customary for all new member species." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "I spent years verifying the data we were given, cross-referencing it with other sources, seeking out primary documents when I could find them. I wanted to truly understand the galaxy we had joined, to know its history and its peoples, and in all those years of research, I found something strange, something that didn't make sense." Ebip's voice grew more intense, more urgent. "Humanity. They're listed as a member species, have been for a very long time. But in all the records of galactic conflicts, all the wars and skirmishes and border disputes, humanity never appears, not once. They never took part in any war, never deployed their fleet, never engaged in any military action at all. For a species of their size and technological capability, this seemed impossible." He paused again, his claws fidgeting with the hem of his robes. "My species tried asking around. We questioned diplomats at council sessions. We consulted with historians from a dozen different worlds. We even petitioned the council archives for more detailed records. But everyone gave us the same answer. They said that humanity is banned from galactic combat and refused to participate. Some became angry when we pressed. Others seemed afraid. Old librarians would stare at us as if we were committing some terrible taboo just by asking the question." Ebip's voice took on a desperate edge, all pretense of scholarly detachment falling away. "Please, honored elder, I have traveled so far to find answers. I need to know. What is the reason behind this mystery? Why is humanity banned? What did they do? What could possibly warrant such a universal prohibition?" For a long moment there was silence. Then the statue vibrated again, more vigorously this time, the sensation traveling through Ebip's body, where he sat pressed against its base. His translation implant parsed the vibration, and to Ebip's surprise, what came through was laughter. It was a strange sound, rendered into his mind through the filter of alien thought patterns and the mechanical translation of his implant. But the emotion behind it was unmistakable, bitter memory, the laughter of someone who has seen terrible things and can only respond to them with gallows humor. "It is a very long story, young scholar," the voice said when the laughter subsided. "I may be able to tell it all before sleep claims me once more. The effect of maintaining consciousness, of pushing back against the crystal prison, takes its toll. But before I begin, before I share the tale you seek, we should introduce ourselves properly. I am Kavazik, once a scientist of my people, now merely a monument to their folly." "I am deeply honored to meet you, Kavazik," Ebip said, bowing his head even though he knew the statue could not see the gesture. "Please, I beg you, tell me the story. I must know the truth." "You are lucky, young Ebip," Kavazik said. and there was something in his tone that suggested a sad smile, if such an expression could exist in a being made entirely of crystal.
I am old enough to remember the beginning of this tale. I was there when humanity first joined the Galactic Council as a new species. I witnessed their arrival, watched their early interactions with the established powers. I saw everything that followed.
The scientist paused, and Ebip could sense him gathering his thoughts, reaching back through centuries of memory to find the beginning of the thread.
Humanity's introduction to the galaxy was unremarkable at first, Kavazek began. They were seen as a weak species immediately, evaluated and dismissed by nearly every established power. Even my own people, who at the time still had our flesh and bone forms. Before the crystallization, we looked at them and saw prey.
Ebip leaned forward, his scholarly instincts fully engaged now, drinking in every word.
The avians looked down upon humans from their lofty perches, both literal and figurative, Kavazek continued. The reptilian species, they saw humans as soft-skinned prey animals, lacking the protective scales and natural armor that evolution had granted to proper predators.
The statue vibrated with something that might have been a sigh.
Even the factions of claws and fur, the great predator species, agreed that humans would be easy targets. After all, humans lacked so many things we considered essential for survival. No talons to rend flesh, no beaks to tear and crush. They had no natural weapons at all, so who in their right mind would imagine that behind such apparent weakness stood not prey but the ultimate predator?
But certainly their technology, Ebip started to object, but Kavazek cut him off.
Yes, they had technology, as did all space-faring species, but technology can be matched, can be countered, can be stolen or adapted. We looked beyond their ships and weapons to the creatures themselves, and what we saw seemed weak. Worse still, they loved to walk around with that friendly smile on their faces.
Kavazek's voice took on a tone of deep regret.
We interpreted their smiles as weakness. We thought their friendliness, their eagerness to establish diplomatic relations, their willingness to compromise and negotiate, we saw all of it as evidence that they lacked what it takes for combat, that they were a soft species who would rather bend than break, who would submit rather than fight.
Ebip's scales rippled with a shudder. He was beginning to understand that this assessment had been very, very wrong.
How wrong we were, Kavazek said, echoing Ebip's thoughts. We all ate our words during humanity's first galactic war. And oh, what a magnificent demonstration it was of just how little we understood them.
What happened? Ebip asked, unable to contain his curiosity. His claws dug into the crystalline ground beneath him.
It began with the Trovac species, Kavazek said, his voice taking on a harder edge. Beings with very long claws covered in armored scales that could turn aside most conventional weapons. They had an ancient warrior culture that stretched back thousands of years, with traditions and rituals of combat that they considered sacred. They were proud, fierce, and utterly convinced of their own superiority.
The scientist paused, and Ebip could sense the weight of memory pressing down on the ancient being.
The Trovac had a custom, Kavazek continued. Every time a new species they perceived as weak joined the galactic stage, they would capture a few individuals for their annual hunting game. It was their way of welcoming new species to the galaxy, they claimed. A test of worthiness, a rite of passage. They would release their captives on a game preserve on their homeworld and hunt them through the forests and mountains, giving them a head start and even some rudimentary weapons to make it sporting.
Ebip's eyes widened with horror. They hunted other sentient beings? For sport?
Indeed, Kavazek confirmed, his voice grim. They considered it a sacred tradition, one that honored both the hunters and the hunted. And they derived almost as much entertainment from all the formal complaints and angry notes of disavowal that came afterward. The Galactic Council would convene emergency sessions. Ambassadors would denounce the Trovac in the strongest possible terms. Economic sanctions would be proposed and debated.
And nothing would change, Ebip said quietly.
Nothing would change, Kavasik agreed. The Trovac would pay their fines, endure a few years of reduced trade, and then everything would return to normal. It had been happening for centuries, a predictable cycle that everyone had learned to accept as simply the way things were. The Trovac were powerful enough that no one wanted to push them too hard, and their hunting games, while deplorable, rarely caused damage beyond a handful of individuals. Some even survived, traumatized but alive.
Ebip shifted uncomfortably. So they captured humans?
They did, Kavasik said, and now there was something new in his voice.
Satisfaction, perhaps, or vindication.
A small group of human civilians taken from a transport vessel near the edge of human space. 23 individuals, if I recall correctly, men and women, young and old, representing a variety of human professions and backgrounds. The Trovac prepared for their hunt with great ceremony, as they always did. They announced the date of the hunt months in advance, allowing time for the protests and denunciations to run their course.
The statue vibrated more intensely, and Ebip could hear the anticipation building in Kavasik's voice.
They expected the humans to run, to hide, to use their primitive weapons to set traps and maybe take down a few Trovac hunters before being overwhelmed. They expected fear and desperation and the sweet thrill of the chase. They expected the hunt to last several days, providing good sport for their warriors and good entertainment for those who watched the recordings afterward.
Kavasik paused for dramatic effect, and Ebip found himself holding his breath.
Everything went completely differently than the Trovac could have ever predicted.
What did humanity do? Ebip asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
Humanity dropped hard on their planet during the event, Kavasik said, each word sharp. While the Trovac were planning to hunt those human civilians they had captured, humanity was planning something else entirely.
Then the statue's voice grew colder.
There was no war declaration in the Galactic Council, no formal diplomatic note announcing intent to use military force, no demands for the return of their citizens or threats of consequences if those demands weren't met. Just an unannounced planetary invasion during the night cycle of the Trovac's main continent.
Ebip's jaw hung open, his scholarly composure completely abandoned. An invasion? A full planetary invasion for 23 civilians?
The battle ended before sunrise, Kavasik continued. Human forces struck simultaneously at hundreds of targets across the planet. At least 1,000 Trovac leaders were killed in their sleep. Military commanders, government officials, the organizers of the hunting games. Billions of credits worth of damage was inflicted on military installations, communication networks, and orbital defense platforms. The humans extracted their people, the 23 civilians along with captives of other species from a dozen previous hunts found in Trovac archives, and departed before the Trovac military could even mount a coordinated response.
Ebip's mind reeled. The audacity of it. It painted a picture of humanity that was radically different from the friendly, smiling species Kavasik had initially described. Ebip struggled to find words. That's extraordinary. He trailed off, his scholarly mind already analyzing the implications. Then another thought struck him. But, Honored Elder, I still don't understand. Certainly this alone wouldn't result in humanity being banned from galactic combat. It's aggressive, yes, disproportionate perhaps, but it's not unlike actions other species have taken. The Kavari launched a similar raid on... Kavasik's laughter cut him off, and there was no humor in it this time, only darkness.
This was just the first war humanity fought, young Ebip, if it could even be called a war. And humanity left behind more than just corpses and rubble and traumatized Trovac citizens.
What do you mean? Ebip asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know.
Humanity did more than just retrieve the captured humans, Kavasik explained. They left some presents behind. Drones and AI-powered submarines in the Trovac oceans. Weapons systems designed to remain dormant for long periods and then activate at random intervals to strike at military installations.
For how long? Ebip asked, dreading the answer.
Those weapons remained active and hidden for many decades after, Kavazik said. Nearly 40 standard years. The Trovac had a terrible time disposing of them. Every time they thought they'd found them, destroyed the last one, another would activate somewhere else.
The statue seemed to sag slightly, as if the memory was physically weighing it down.
The Trovac never captured any other species for their hunting games again, Kavazik said quietly. In fact, they withdrew from most galactic affairs entirely. They're still recovering even now, centuries later. Their warrior spirit was fundamentally broken by what humanity did to them.
Ebip sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he was hearing. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice uncertain. That's certainly impressive. He paused, searching for the right word. Cruel, but innovative. However, Honored Elder, I still don't see why humanity was banned from galactic combat to the point where you can't even find books about it, to the point where old species refuse to comment about it, to the point where old, fat librarians stare at you as if you are a pariah just for asking a simple question about human military history. Ebip realized as he finished speaking that he might have been too specific about his own struggles, revealing perhaps more of his personal frustration than was appropriate for a scholarly inquiry. He fell silent, embarrassed. But Kavazik's laughter was gentle this time, almost sympathetic.
You don't have to worry, young Ebip, the ancient being said. I understand your frustration. I can hear it in your voice. The years of being shut out and shut down, of hitting walls everywhere you turned. But I promise you this, you won't leave this planet without the truth. I will tell you everything, every terrible detail, so that you can return to your people with full knowledge of why the galaxy fears humanity so much.
Please, Ebip urged, relief flooding through him. Please continue.
The Galactic Council responded to humanity's first victory in a way that, in retrospect, sealed many fates, Kavazik said. Some species saw the lesson humanity had taught the Trovac and took it to heart. They decided that peaceful coexistence with humanity was the wisest course. But others, including my own people, saw things differently.
Ebip swallowed hard, a sense of dread building in his gut. He said nothing, simply listened as the Elder continued.
We saw the lesson humanity taught to the Trovac not as a warning to leave them alone, but as evidence of a species worth challenging. We saw them as potential threats who needed to be contained before they could grow too powerful, before their technology could advance too far, before they could establish themselves as a true galactic power. We saw them as a problem that needed to be solved while it was still solvable.
Kavazik's voice took on a bitter edge.
We were fools, arrogant, short-sighted fools.
The statue vibrated with what might have been a sigh, or perhaps a shudder of remembered pain.
Over the next 170 years, various wars did not result in humanity's defeat. Instead, they left a shocked council that learned, time after time, that humanity did not play by the same rules as everyone else. They were a species that fought war differently, that approached conflict from angles we could not predict.
Different how? Ebip asked, leaning forward intently.
8 major categories that I witnessed personally, Kavazik said. 8 entirely new approaches to warfare that the galaxy had never seen before, or if we had seen glimpses of them, never implemented with such devastating effectiveness. Let me tell you some of them.
The vibration grew stronger, more focused, as if the act of teaching was giving him energy.
The Kelkor species, beings of silicon-based biology with a natural resistance to most environmental toxins, tried to attack Earth with typical chemical warfare. They deployed atmospheric contaminants, poison gases, compounds designed to seep into the soil and water and make the planet uninhabitable. Standard tactics that had worked for them in dozens of previous conflicts.
Ebip nodded. Chemical warfare was well documented in galactic military history, used by various species with varying degrees of success.
Humanity replied with biological warfare, Kavasik said, and there was a note of dark admiration in his voice. But not in any way we had seen before. They introduced a creature called the mosquito to the Kelkor colonies. A mosquito? Ebip asked, unfamiliar with the term. A tiny flying insect that feeds on blood and reproduces rapidly, Kavasik explained. By itself relatively harmless, but humanity had genetically engineered thousands of variants, each one carrying different pathogens specifically tailored to Kelkor biology. Diseases that attacked their silicon-based cellular structure, that disrupted their metabolic processes, that caused slow degenerative conditions with no immediate cure. Ebip felt his scales prickling with horror. The Kelkor spent the next 3 centuries developing vaccines and medical countermeasures, Kavasik continued. Their entire civilization became focused on disease prevention and management. They never had time for war again. The statue paused, letting that sink in. Humanity also perfected psychological warfare, Kavasik said. Not just the long-term effects of what they did to the Trovak, but active campaigns designed to break their enemies' will to fight without even engaging in direct combat. They would broadcast messages that exploited specific cultural fears, that turned allies against each other, that made enemy soldiers question their orders and their leaders. Ibip shifted uncomfortably, trying to imagine what that must have been like. They developed guerrilla tactics that made conventional military responses completely useless, Kavasik continued. They would hide among civilian populations, strike at supply lines rather than military targets, appear and disappear like ghosts. Species with massive, powerful militaries found themselves unable to bring their strength to bear against an enemy they couldn't find. Anything else? Ebip asked, remembering that Kavasik had mentioned 8 entirely new approaches to warfare. Ah, yes, the ancient scientist said, his voice grim. When subtlety and cleverness were not enough, humanity could also demonstrate raw, terrifying power. I witnessed human ships crack a moon in half during a territorial dispute, merely to make a point at the negotiating table. They call this doctrine overwhelming firepower. Ebip could imagine it all too well. The psychological impact alone would be devastating. You mentioned 8 categories, Ebip said carefully. What were the others? Economic warfare, turning enemy economies against themselves, Kavasik said. Cyber warfare, attacks on computer systems and AI networks that left entire civilizations blind and paralyzed. Information warfare, controlling narratives and manipulating public opinion to make their enemies' own populations turn against them. The statue paused, and Ebip sensed hesitation. And then there was something the Galactic Council began to call romantic warfare, Kavasik said, his voice carefully neutral. Ebip's curiosity was immediately piqued. Romantic warfare? What does that mean? How can romance be a weapon? Trust me, young one, Kavasik said firmly, his voice brooking no argument. There are certain things that you don't want to know. I will not elaborate, and you should not pursue this line of inquiry further. Ibip blinked, surprised. The elder had been so cooperative so far, sharing information freely, even when it painted his own species in an unflattering light. This was the first time Kavasik had refused to elaborate on something. The refusal itself was almost more disturbing than whatever the truth might be. In a rare moment of wisdom, Ebip suppressed his scholarly curiosity and followed the elder's advice and moved on. Was humanity banned from galactic combat after all these innovations? He asked instead. Surely the Council must have seen the danger they represented. Kavasik's voice became serious, all traces of dark humor vanishing. They should have been banned, the scientist said quietly. Many species argued for it. Many ambassadors stood before the Council and pleaded for restrictions to be placed on humanity, for limitations on their military capabilities, for some kind of control before they became too powerful to stop. But there was one species who still hadn't challenged humanity, and this species vetoed every attempt by the Galactic Council to forbid military engagement with humans. Ebip felt a cold sensation spreading through his body, a premonition of terrible truth approaching. "That species was my people," Kavazik said, his voice heavy with ancient regret. "We made this decision from the very planet you're standing on right now. This world that you see is a barren wasteland of green crystals. This was our home world, our seat of power, the center of our civilization." Confusion flooded through Ebip's mind. He looked around at the desolate landscape, trying to imagine it as anything other than what it was. A dead world, beautiful in its own crystalline way, but utterly lifeless. "What happened?" he asked, though his mind was already daring to imagine that perhaps this world had not always been such a barren place. The statue of the Elder was silent for a long moment, and when Kavazik finally spoke, his voice exuded a sadness so profound that it made Ebip's heart ache in sympathy. "We took a decision based on fear of the future," the scientist said quietly. "We saw humanity's innovations, their victories, their growing strength, and we convinced ourselves that they needed to be stopped before they became unstoppable. We believed that we were different from the species that had come before us, that our superior technology and strategic planning would be enough to defeat them where others had failed." Kavazik paused, and Ebip could sense the weight of centuries of guilt pressing down on the ancient being. "We attacked humanity in the year 2013, after they had joined the Council. And unlike every other species before us, we actually managed to hit Earth with a devastating weapon. We had been developing it in secret for decades, a nano-machine cascade that could darken a planet's sky by consuming atmospheric particles and converting them into light-absorbing compounds. It was an experimental technology, barely tested, but we deployed it anyway, in our desperation to strike a decisive blow." "You darkened Earth's sky?" Ebip asked, horrified. "We did," Kavazik confirmed, "and we celebrated our victory in the years that followed. Earth's sun couldn't reach the surface. Plants died by the billions. Animals starved or froze. Entire ecosystems collapsed. Humanity was very weakened, suffering from cold and starvation and disease. Their population dropped by millions, but they still refused to flee their planet to any of their colonies. They were stubborn. They endured." The statue seemed to shudder. "And they studied our weapon," Kavazik continued. "They analyzed it, tested it, worked to understand every aspect of how it functioned. They devoted every resource they had to the problem. Every scientist and engineer and computer system, it became their sole focus." "How long did it take them to find a solution?" Ebip asked, though something in Kavazik's tone told him he wouldn't like the answer. "Humanity found a way to understand, stop, and reverse engineer our weapon in just 20 years, the scientist said. 20 years. We had spent nearly a century developing it, and they cracked it in 2 decades, while simultaneously fighting off the effects of a dying planet. By the time Earth's sky cleared, by the time the sun shone on their world again, the humans were very angry." Kavazik's voice dropped even lower. "More than angry, furious. A few million humans had died. Various Earth species had been driven extinct from their natural habitats. Creatures that had existed for millions of years wiped out in a mere 2 decades. The whole planet had taken a hard hit that would take centuries to fully heal, and humanity wanted us to understand what we had done, to truly comprehend it." Ebip's eyes widened as he looked around the barren, crystalline world. Before he could even formulate his question, the Elder spoke. "Our planet was hit with a similar nano-replication weapon to the one we'd used on Earth," Kavazik said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The humans delivered it in 7 days after Earth's atmosphere recovered. Just 7 days. They didn't make demands first, didn't offer us a chance to surrender, didn't give any warning at all. They simply struck the way we had struck them. The ancient scientist fell silent for a moment, and Ebip could hear something that might have been a sob in the vibrations of the statue. "Look around you, Ebip," Kavazik said. "Everything that existed here became crystals. The oceans, the forests, the cities, the mountains, all of it transformed into this lifeless green expanse you see. And every stubborn scientist who stayed rather than flee to the colonies, everyone who tried to undo the damage, everyone who thought they could reverse the process before it was too late, they became statues, trapped in their own bodies, like me." Ebip felt tears forming in his eyes. The magnitude of the tragedy was overwhelming, almost incomprehensible. An entire world, billions of lives, a civilization's history and culture, and accumulated knowledge, all of it reduced to crystals and silent statues. "We never understood the weapon," Kavazik admitted, his voice breaking. "We tried for decades, then centuries. Our best minds, our most advanced computer systems, all of our resources devoted to the problem, but we couldn't crack it. We lost more than our homeworld and the ability to wage war. The survivors, scattered across our colony worlds, they lost even the will to fight. We withdrew from the Galactic Council, became recluses. We stopped participating in galactic affairs entirely."
"And the Council?" Ebip asked quietly. "What did they do when they saw this?"
"The Galactic Council finally forbade humanity from joining wars after seeing what was left of our planet," Kavazik said. "They enforced it with clauses that required every species to protect Earth with everything they had in case humanity was ever attacked. A collective defense pact, essentially, that made attacking Earth equivalent to attacking the entire galaxy. They also established an agreement to pay humanity an annual fee, a tribute, really, so that humans wouldn't expand their war fleet anymore." The scientist's voice took on a bitter edge. "Humanity accepted these terms. They scaled back their military, maintained only a defensive fleet, and turned their attention to other pursuits. But the memory of what they could do, what they had done to us, that memory lived on." Ebip sat in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process everything he had learned. The pieces were finally coming together, and the picture they formed was more terrifying than he had ever imagined. Time passed, he wasn't sure how long. The red star above moved slightly in the sky, casting longer shadows across the crystalline landscape. Finally, Ebip managed to form a coherent thought. "So humanity is weaker now?" he asked, grasping at the hope that the restrictions had actually accomplished something. The bans, the tribute, the limitations, they've contained the threat? Kavazik's laughter was ironic, bitter, and somehow sad all at once. "Humans don't have a large fleet, that's true," the scientist said. "They maintain only enough ships to defend their core systems as per the agreement. But their technology kept improving. They never stopped innovating, never stopped pushing the boundaries of what was possible. And now," the statue seemed to sag even further. "Now no one knows how strong they really are," Kavazik finished. "That's what truly terrifies the galaxy, young Ebip. Not what humanity has done, but what they might be capable of doing if they were ever provoked again. We know what they could do centuries ago. We have no idea what they can do now." Ebip opened his mouth to ask another question, his scholarly mind already formulating a dozen new inquiries based on what he had learned. But before he could speak, Kavazik interrupted him. "It's time for you to go, young scholar," the elder said urgently, "unless you want to become an immortal crystal statue yourself." Ebip glanced down at his robes in confusion, then felt his heart nearly stop. The small decorative crystals he had woven into the fabric, traditional ornaments from his homeworld, had begun to glow with a faint luminescence. They were still very tiny right now, barely noticeable unless you looked closely, but the implication was clear. The crystallization process was beginning, and if he stayed much longer, he would share Kavazik's fate. "Thank you, honored elder." Ebip said, scrambling to his feet. His voice was rushed but sincere. "Thank you for sharing this truth with me. I will never forget what you've told me." "Go," Kavazik said simply, "and tell your people, tell them everything." Ebip ran. He rushed back toward his ship, his robe streaming behind him in the constant wind, his lungs burning with the effort. He finally understood why humanity had been banned from galactic combat. Not to punish them, not to limit them, but to protect everyone else from ever making the mistake of attacking them again. When he reached his ship, Ebip tore off his robes and threw them onto the crystalline ground, not wanting to take any contaminated material with him. He sealed himself in the airlock and initiated the emergency departure sequence. As his vessel lifted off from Vanar's surface, Ebip took one last look at the barren world below. He could see the statues dotting the landscape like crystalline tombstones, thousands of them, each one a being trapped in eternal silence. A civilization destroyed by their own hubris, by their inability to recognize when they were facing something beyond their understanding. He set course for home, his mind already composing the report he would present to the Zorip Council. He would tell them everything he had learned, every terrible detail, and he would end with a simple recommendation, one that he knew would shape his species' foreign policy for generations to come. Whatever they might achieve in the future, whatever heights of power or technology they might reach, the Zorip should never, ever consider doing anything to anger humanity. Some sleeping predators were best left undisturbed.